So I'm going to introduce Keith. We've been working on this for a long time. I think we decided to select the team that we selected to do this work 12 months ago, I think. I mean, so we've been through a long procurement process at that point. So I can't tell you how thrilled I am. Keith is here to make a presentation to you this morning about this. And he's got an amazing team. They put together Catherine, and Carrie, and Carlos, and everybody on this team. He'll talk about it, but I think, but I'll talk about it and say it's a really amazing collection of people that'll be working on this. And for me, everything that we're doing in the planning department, it's worth doing exceptionally. Atlanta is an amazing place. We all know that, where the near future and the longer future presents so many wonderful opportunities for us. And I know we feel it's important that we don't just do things medium, but we try to do things as good as anybody's doing it. And I think we have the right team to do that. I learned about Biohabitats back in, I'd say, 2010. I was in Portland for the eco districts training they had started. Learned about them and tried to get Keith to work on something in Charleston where the old Cooper River bridges are, if you know where that is on an old creek. And there was a lot of discussion in an area that floods a lot. There was a lot of discussion about concrete and pump stations and things. So I approached Keith about looking at restoring the creek as an alternative, and then I left Charleston and nothing happened on it. I think there's some concrete there now. But the thing about this is, if you know about the city design project, which I hope you do, and I started describing it like this recently, to me, and we compare it, I know it's not as good as this, but we compared it to Chicago Plan of 1909, just in terms of the table it's trying to set for the city. And for me, nature in Atlanta is the Lake Michigan waterfront that was to Chicago, in the sense that if you look at Atlanta and you say, what would we need to do in order to make this, one of the best cities anywhere, it's to do the nature and the urban really well together, and that intersection together. Because if we do that exceptionally, then, and we've done it. I mean, you're doing it. Everybody here is doing it. I mean, I'm not saying it's not being done. I'm just saying that the city has a responsibility here too, and that is to basically put in place a framework where we can do all of that as well as anybody's done it. So we're going to come up with a different name other than urban ecology framework, because you don't smile when you say that. It sounds like a procedure of some kind. So we'll have a different name. If you have an idea, let us know after hearing from Keith. But happy to have him here and present to you what they're about to engage us on, because this will be a very public process. And so Keith, come on.
Great. Thank you. Thanks everybody for showing up bright and early this morning. Hopefully you've all had your coffee and tea. Thank you, Tim, for that introduction. And I think we may be still working on that in Charleston, hopefully. So, Charleston is certainly, I'm living in Charleston now, and I'm certainly faced with a lot of issues in terms of sea level rise and other factors. But I was here a couple of weeks ago for a conference called Eco Districts, and Tim mentioned that, and we met in 2010 out in Portland. And Eco Districts is about this idea of communities taking on, sustainability in a way that, from a community perspective, can really reap a lot of benefits. And so I know that there's efforts underway in the city of Atlanta to do an eco district here. And we had a great 2 or 3 days here in Atlanta, and certainly learned a lot from that. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the urban ecology framework. As Commissioner Keane said, it's not a very sexy name, so hopefully we can come up with a better name on that. As Commissioner Keane also said, we're still not quite contracted for the project, so I can talk about what we're going to do, but I can't talk about what we've done. So we'll go into that, but now is the time to get your ideas out and your thoughts out on this as we hopefully get started in the next couple of weeks. Typically, these are some slides from the city design process, and some of you may have seen these or have seen the book that was produced. It's online now, and I think it's being produced right now in hard copy form, right? And one of the things that city design looks at is the growth in Atlanta, right? And that not changing is not an option. We're going to grow here in Atlanta. And how we grow is really important. So the most strategic scenario for growth includes everyone, right? We all need to be included in that process here. And city design really took its sort of foundation from Dr. King in terms of the aftermath of nonviolence and reconciliation and the creation of the beloved community. And the beloved community has become sort of the framework for city design, which I think is a great segue into what we're going to be doing from an urban ecology framework. And sort of the 5 pillars here in terms of city design are equity, progress, ambition, access, and nature. And today we're going to focus on nature. And I think it's also pretty extraordinary that nature takes a role in city here, and it is one of the 5 pillars of the city design process. So the approach is looking at growth areas, and looking at growth areas as sort of those arteries or spines that come out from the central core. But there's also conservation areas, and those conservation areas are designated to connect nature and protect other things that we value. So how do we go about protecting nature and connecting nature throughout the city of Atlanta? And that's going to be our charge over the next 18 months, is to figure out how that happens. And so city design has come up with the phrase, we're going to design for people, we're going to design for nature, and we're going to design for people in nature, which really provides, again, a great framework for where we start here. I fear that I'm probably speaking a lot to the choir here and to sort of the tribe of nature in the city, but I thought I would go through a little bit of maybe introduction to this for those of you that aren't quite familiar. There's been a lot of work over the last probably couple decades in looking at urban ecology and the whole science of urban ecology and the social and economic aspects of urban ecology. So it's a relatively new field, but a field that's beginning to grow quite substantially, and one that we can begin pulling resources in from some of the work that's already been done. There's been 2 long-term studies of urban ecology in the United States funded by the National Science Foundation. One of those is out in Phoenix, Arizona. The other is in Baltimore, Maryland. And in Baltimore, the Cary Research Institute, which is based out in New York, has been doing a long-term ecosystem study of Baltimore for about the past 20, maybe even 25 years there. And a lot of good information in science, both ecological, environmental science, and social science has come out of those long-term studies that I think are really applicable to the work that we're going to be doing here in Atlanta. So when we think about ecology of and for cities, there's a lot of things that we look at. We look at everything from sort of the human ecosystem framework to ecosystem services that I'll talk about in a minute, to feedback, to the sort of social ecological systems and resiliency, which is a word we hear quite a bit these days, all the way to sort of the more ecological or environmental scientific aspects of urban ecology and how they all come together to form sort of the place where we work, we play, we live in the city. And so all these things are going to be combined, and we're going to be looking at them in greater detail for the city of Atlanta. Now, one of the reasons that we look at urban ecology is because ecosystems provide a lot of services for us, right? They provide everything from biodiversity and soil formation to food, to clean water, to clean air, to healthy soils. These ecosystem services are in a sense free to us. And in many areas of the country and the world, we've degraded ecosystems and we're beginning to lose some of these services. And I think it's incumbent upon cities like Atlanta and other cities around the world to think about ways that they can begin to restore or regenerate some of these ecosystem services within the city, and how they can leverage that even outside the city. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at in this urban ecology study is these ecosystem services. What role do they play in the city of Atlanta? What's the value of those ecosystem services, and how they benefit people throughout the city. The other thing that we're going to be looking at is biological diversity, right? The diversity of ecosystems within the city, the diversity of species, and even the diversity of the genetic aspects of species, whether it's plants or animals, and how they live in the city, how they move around, how they enrich the city, how they enrich our well-being in the city. So biological diversity is going to be an important factor in looking at urban ecosystems here. In fact, one of the things we talk a lot about climate change, and climate change is certainly an issue that we're all dealing with, but what doesn't get talked about much is the loss of biological diversity around the world. And many scientists are now saying that we're under this 6th grade extinction, right? That we're losing biodiversity at an alarming rate. And I love this quote from E.O. Wilson, the biologist from Harvard. He says, "If all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos." Right? So imagine a city where we're doing everything we can for pollinator species and insects, right? How can we really leverage that idea and make this city a pollinator pathway or a pollinator city? And how can we combine that into this urban design framework? Around the world, there's a movement by the United Nations and by the World Conservation Congress, IUCN, and others, and the Conventional Biological Diversity to bring biodiversity back to cities. And so there are some great examples out there of how cities like Singapore, some others in Germany and Australia have begun to look at how biodiversity can play a role in cities. And so I think Atlanta can really embrace this idea and take this idea and demonstrate how biodiversity can play a role in its city. The other idea is resiliency, right? Michael just mentioned that, and that's the theme of the conference coming up in March here, is resiliency. And urban ecology certainly plays a role in resiliency. And I would say that ecology in general, whether you're in an urban area or not, has a huge role in the resiliency of our communities. In terms of looking at water scarcity, in terms of climate change, air pollution, storms, disturbance events, and certainly human health. And so when we look at the urban ecology framework for the city of Atlanta, we're going to be looking at all these factors here. And I think the city of Atlanta has experienced probably every one of these factors at some point in time, if not experiencing them now. So the whole idea of resiliency is going to play a major role or a major theme in the urban ecology framework that we're going to be putting together. And then this whole idea of biophilia, right? And another term coined by E.O. Wilson. The idea that, we possess this innate tendency to seek connections with nature and other forms of life. So from a social cultural standpoint in the city of Atlanta, how can we bring nature back into the city so people have that experience, they can experience this? We always like to think about blurring, what we call blurring the boundaries between parks and non-parks. So you don't even know you're going into a park. right? How can we blur the boundaries out there so we have an urban ecology framework that really sets up the idea that you can experience nature at maybe different scales, different intensities throughout the day as you live and work and commute through Atlanta. And then this whole idea of human health, right? There's a movement underway now by the Urban Land Institute, the Public Trust for Public Lands, the National Recreation and Park Association, to kind of launch this idea of everybody should be within a 10-minute walk of the park, right? Everybody. And we know that there are areas out in our urban areas where green space doesn't exist, or the quality of green space isn't what it needs to be for people to adequately use that green space. So looking at the urban ecology framework from a human health standpoint, from an access standpoint, from an inclusionary standpoint is going to be really important as we move forward with this project. The other big one is trees, right? That's really what defines Atlanta in terms of, if you look at urban ecology, the canopy cover over Atlanta, and I know you all know this much better than I do, is one of the major assets of the city of Atlanta. So obviously the urban ecology framework is going to be really heavily focused on trees, both trees and water systems, right? So the idea of the tree canopy in Atlanta now, what is it now? What is it going to be in the future? I know there have been roundtables and conferences on this by many organizations, and there's many organizations throughout the city of Atlanta that are working on this. And our job sort of is to bring all that information together, synthesize all that information, and see how it fits into this urban ecology framework that we're going to be working on. And I think we all know sort of all the benefits of urban trees. There are a lot in terms of mitigating air pollution, conserving energy, affecting sort of the microclimate, helping out from a stormwater management standpoint. Probably the number one thing we can do for stormwater management is plant more trees, right? And so the tree canopy cover over Atlanta, the types of trees that we have, where they're planted, how they're aligned, the density, the diversity, all that will be taken into consideration as we're working on this framework here. So there have been a lot of these types of, not a lot, but there have been some of these types of plans done for cities throughout the world, and I'll just briefly go through a couple of them for you, and then a couple that we've been working on, and then I'll get into a little bit more detail on the urban ecology framework. So Barcelona has been working on a plan here to bring back sort of green infrastructure and biodiversity into their city. And if you know Barcelona at all, you know that the center of the city is pretty dense. It's an old town. In fact, there isn't many trees in the center of the city. There isn't many green spaces in the center of Barcelona. They have a lot of green space around the edges, but not much in the city. So one of their sort of plans is, how can we bring more green space into the center of the city? And rooftops and reimagining some of these city streets, city squares as these sort of green spaces, green spots that will connect to the outer ring of green space around the city of Barcelona is something that we're going to be looking at. And certainly a precedent that we're going to be looking at as well as we think about the core of the city of Atlanta and the downtown district versus the outlying districts. Right? Hamburg, Germany has come up with a green network plan that really looks at climate change and takes into consideration climate change and how that will begin to affect their green space there, how it will affect the vegetation communities, the biodiversity within the city, how will that change over time, how do you deal with it on a day-to-day practical basis in terms of planting trees or taking care of trees or waterways, and then also how do you interpret that landscape for people as that change begins to happen. And so Hamburg, the green network plan for Hamburg also offers some ideas and precedents for the work we will be doing here. San Francisco has come up with a plan of looking at, they sort of applied this idea of conservation biology, where they're looking at these nodes or habitats and these corridors between these habitats. And these corridors can be streets and street trees, and how do they play a role in sort of reconnecting up some of the green space that is in San Francisco? How does wildlife move through and about the city of San Francisco and through those open spaces? And so again, there's another great precedent where we can begin to look at how, in this case, San Francisco is applying these ideas of conservation biology and urban ecology to their city. And Edmonton, Canada has come up with a great green network plan. It's called BREATHE. And I think that's exactly what Commissioner Keane is thinking about in terms of a different name for the urban ecology framework for the city of Atlanta. But here again, they've got a major river going through their city here, and it's all about how do they take advantage of that major river corridor and sort of the arteries that span off of that corridor and create that sort of green network for the city of Edmonton here, and how do they connect up each one of the neighborhoods to that overall green network. In Kansas City, this is a project we've been working on in several phases over the past couple years, and this is being done by a regional council, the Mid-America Regional Council, or MARC, in Kansas City, which includes not only the city, but the whole metropolitan area around the city. And there they're looking at sort of this interconnected system of public and private natural areas, greenways, and trails that link together all the communities throughout the Kansas City metropolitan area. And this has been a project that's very community focused, very a lot of intense meetings and outreach that's been involved in this project over the years. And we've been working with them to help them look at their natural resources, how to evaluate the natural resources, how to then take those natural resources and synthesize that with their transportation network, with their neighborhoods, and with the existing green spaces that they have out there. I think this, again, will provide another good precedent for some of the work that we'll be doing here in the city of Atlanta. This process has been going on with Kansas City probably for over a decade now. We've been involved only, like I said, for the past couple years. But it's an ongoing process. And I think it's, just like the next project I'll show, it's survived several sort of administrative changes within the city of Atlanta and with the surrounding region. And the reason is because the public has really been behind this project. Right? There's a real strong grassroots effort there, and so that's been a really good sort of blessing for that community in terms of carrying on with this green network idea. We recently, or we're still just wrapping up Baltimore Green Network project here, where Baltimore basically came and said, look, we've got all these vacant and abandoned properties. We have some real issues with disadvantaged communities not having access to green space, and we want to find a way to look at Baltimore's vacant lands, look at the legacy of green spaces that are in Baltimore, look at that from not only an ecological or an environmental perspective, but a social, economic perspective as well. So we've been working with the city of Baltimore now for about 1.5 years in doing a lot of community outreach, going to a lot of community meetings, and really asking the communities what they want in terms of green space. And as you can imagine, just like Atlanta with, I think, 23 different neighborhoods in Atlanta? More. Well, there's way more neighborhoods, right? Planning units, I guess, or neighborhood planning units, right? Yeah, there's like 160 or something. I don't know. I will know soon. That every community is different, right? Every community has their sort of own ideas about what green space means to them, what the quality of green space means to to them, how well they want that green space connected to other areas, what does it mean in terms of access to that green space, but access to other areas of the community as well. How safe do they feel in that green space is a big concern. And so all these go into thinking about how we design this green space network or this framework to make sure that communities are really involved in that process. So, what is the urban ecology framework for the city of Atlanta? I don't know. So that's a great photo there. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work that Eric Sanderson's done in New York City called Manhattan. If you are, you should Google it and look it up. But Eric works for the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York City, and what he's done is he's spent probably the last 6-7 years researching what Manhattan looked like before it was developed. And he has been able to, going back through records, he has been able to completely reimagine what that landscape was back before the Dutch actually settled that island, where all the streams used to be, the wetlands used to be, the type of forest that was there. And it's used as sort of a blueprint that now even there's developers within the city of New York and Manhattan that look at this and say, okay, what was here previously? How can my building provide the same kind of ecosystem services that were here before Manhattan was developed, and how can we embed that in sort of the sustainability of that? It's a wonderful, he has a book out on it. It's a wonderful, the website's very interactive, and you can kind of go through Manhattan and pinpoint an area, and basically this will happen, and you can see what it used to look like there. So we often think of cities as steel and concrete, roads and parking lots, and skyscrapers and apartments, but underlying all that great infrastructure is a landscape that was first sculpted by rivers and streams, covered by forests and grasslands, and teeming with birds and mammals. And that's sort of the underlying approach that we took to how we would approach this urban ecology framework for the city of Atlanta. That underlying all this asphalt out here, all these buildings, all these communities, was a pretty rich, vibrant landscape at one time. And we all know that we're not going to bring back that landscape. In fact, I'm fond of saying that we're not really restoring the past, we're restoring the future, right? We're moving forward. And we're moving forward in an urban area, and how do we bring attributes of that past back, but really combine it with where we are today and where we will be in the next 25, 30 years as the city design process has sort of framed it for us. And so, as we embark on this, we're going to be looking at the Atlanta City Design Project, and the Urban Ecology Framework will sort of provide, I think, the backbone for ensuring that we have a more resilient, vibrant, and healthy city. And I think that's what the city design process was getting at in terms of people and people in nature and people in nature, that we really want this urban ecology framework to be the backbone of that sort of vibrant and healthy city there. So the purpose, the sort of technical purpose of this ecology framework is to establish the natural context for Atlanta's growth and development, and determine aspects of nature in Atlanta, what aspects of the nature in Atlanta should be preserved, restored, and accentuated by the public realm, right? So that's what we're really going to be looking at here. One of the challenges we have is we know that I think about close to 70% of all the tree canopy in Atlanta is on private property, right? And so while we're going to be looking at all that, right now in terms of the framework, what we can sort of control from a citywide perspective is the public realm. But how can we use that to leverage what happens on private property? I think is going to be really important here. So we kind of define the success of this as being based on uncovering the essence of what makes Atlanta naturally unique, right? Atlanta, unlike other cities, has certain features, a cultural, social, economic history that's unique to no other city in the world. So how do we find the essence of that? How do we build that into this plan? How do we give form to that uniqueness? And most importantly, how do we thrive in a relationship with one another that's rooted in this place here? So that's really how we kind of define success with this framework. That's a great idea. Wildness in terms of how wild things can be in an urban area is certainly nuanced here, but we're anchored by, I think, two great attributes here, the Chattahoochee River Park and potentially a South River Park, right? And how can those sort of serve as the armature for how we begin to connect up green space within and throughout the city of Atlanta. And then sort of, again, going back to this idea of biophilia and reconnecting with nature, how do we design for retreat and adventure? How do we get out? I don't know if any of you walk parts of Proctor Creek, right? But you can be down in Proctor Creek and think you're out in the wilderness somewhere. It's really great. So there are certainly areas within the city that you can get really absorbed in and not even realize that you're in an urban area. And in other ways, you can celebrate that you're in that sort of environment in an urban area. And then how do we design for connections throughout the city of Atlanta? Like many of the precedents I showed, connections are going to be really important. We've got a great backbone with the Beltline now, and how do we take advantage of that and use that to radiate out and reconnect to the Chattahoochee and the South River Park and make this area where you could bike or walk or hike throughout the whole city of Atlanta and stay within all these sort of green spaces. So there are 5 really areas of emphasis that will guide our planning process through. One is that we want to ensure that whatever we come up with is implementable, that there are some projects, sort of low-hanging fruit projects that we can begin to look at how we can implement them that would have a really great impact on contributing to the interconnectedness of these green spaces. Equity and inclusiveness is a huge issue and something that is going to be embedded in the whole planning process and certainly embedded in the Green Network framework too. How can we, again, engage with the communities and citizens of Atlanta to make that happen? What's the priority for reuse of vacant and abandoned property? So again, there's a lot of work beginning to be done on that. Not only the work that was done in Baltimore, but Detroit and some of the other Rust Belt cities are really looking at how they can take these vacant, abandoned properties and make it part of an overall wider green network plan. And then what's the implementation strategy for this, right? Where are we going to get funding? How creative can we be with that funding? What kinds of priorities do we have on projects? What are the projects that we can do now that will seed future projects as we move forward? So all those are going to be part of how we develop this framework here. So when we looked at this and we thought, we came up with sort of 3 themes in terms of addressing the green urban ecology framework and green network for the city of Atlanta. One is science-driven, place-based, right? We have to have really good science behind all this in order for it to stand up sort of to the test of scrutiny, but it also has to be place-based. All the science in the world isn't going to do anything or be any good unless people buy into it, unless it's about this place here. So while we can look at precedents in other cities, which we will, it's really about the science of what's going on here in the city of Atlanta and the surrounding region that's going to play a major role here. So we're going to be doing everything from GIS mapping, geographical information systems. There's been a lot of great information that's been done, or a lot of great analysis has been done over the past couple decades, and we're certainly going to take advantage of all that. We're going to be hopefully contacting, working with a lot of people out there and doing that. This diagrams on the left are some diagrams that we did from the city of Baltimore, where we looked at sort of legacy green network plans. We looked at communities, we looked at transportation structures, we looked at socioeconomic factors, we looked at health factors within the city of Baltimore, and all of that was sort of synthesized to help us develop where these sort of priorities or areas are for urban ecology, and then looking at it from a biodiversity standpoint and ecosystem services perspective. The chart on the right is really interesting. We've been working with the city of Philadelphia throughout their park system for the past 10 years. And while you may have a hard time seeing it, the sort of graph on the left, these are graphs of trees. The density and variety or species of trees that were found in the parks in 1907, and then the ones that are found now in 2007. And we see a real discrepancy of what was there before versus what's there now. And again, the whole idea of working with the city is not to go back and try to restore those same species that may be the same densities or composition, but the idea is to look forward and say, okay, given climate change, given the complexities and juxtaposition of industrial and commercial and transportation networks through the city, what kind of forest and environmental parks do we want in the future? And that's something, again, we'll be looking at with the city of Atlanta of how to do that. And then coming up with these models, right? How do we model all this? How do we synthesize and bring all this information together to develop this framework is going to be really important. And I think the most important thing about these models is that they're transparent. They're not a black box. And that everybody can see how these models were developed, what was prioritized. They have a chance to offer other suggestions and input on these models. And they can be changed over time as priorities change within the city. Over time, these models can be tweaked to adjust or calibrate some of the outcomes that we hope to expect. And then certainly with climate change, it's going to be a big issue, especially with the tree canopy in the city of Atlanta. The forest, there's going to be dispersion and shifting is going to be happening throughout the forest, throughout the United States and in Georgia and in the Piedmont, southern Piedmont region of Atlanta. There's going to be an increase in forest fires. There's going to be rising tree lines, meaning trees are going to migrate north or upslope. And there's probably going to be more disease and pest infestations as this change begins to happen over the next 50 to 100 years. And so how does that play a role in the tree canopy and urban ecology framework for the city? And then going back and bringing that back down to the neighborhoods, right? Taking all that science and looking at how that's going to play a role in the city of Atlanta. Those goats, I think, were over at Westlake Park eating up kudzu there. It's a great effective way of not only getting rid of all your invasive species, but all your species. And then that's Proctor Creek, right? Proctor Creek within the city of Atlanta. And how great, what a great creek that is down there. And again, you can be sort of down there and not even know that you're in the city, but obviously two different neighborhoods, two different ways of looking at green space, different characteristics, and that's going to be really important to take that science and look at how it's applied there. Our other tenet is what we call richly layered and intricately connected, right? That we call this sort of right of reciprocity. The idea that we're going to have this layered and intricately connected systems of green spaces, greenways, natural features, teeming with life, interwoven throughout the fabric of Atlanta. And that's sort of the other thing that we're going to be looking at is how do we take this idea? And how do we take this idea from what we call a 30,000-foot level and looking at how Atlanta fits into the regional landscape, how it's connected, using sort of the sciences of landscape ecology and conservation biology, how is Atlanta connected to its outer regions? And how do those connections really service Atlanta, and how does Atlanta service the outer regions? So we know in those connections we have species movement, right? Species, whether they're migratory birds or other species, move in and out of the region, and they move through corridors, forested corridors, and down river valleys and stream systems. We have mammals that move around, and we have things like nutrients. Nutrients flow across the landscape, water flows across the landscape, and they don't stop or start at the boundary of the city of Atlanta. They flow in and out of the city. And so we're going to be looking at some of those things from a broader perspective. In fact, the whole idea of sort of landscape ecology is that species need to move just like people need to move on highways and roads and sidewalks. So do birds, mammals, insects, and other species. We're going to be looking at how they can move throughout the city, either through these sort of connected, maybe streams or river systems, or what we call these stepping stones, which are really our parks, like Piedmont Park, or our parks in our neighborhoods that may only be a couple blocks, but they act as stepping stones for species as they move through the area. Even street trees and how street trees are oriented throughout an area begins to play a role there. So we even took a stab at our first cut of the city of Atlanta in terms of looking at what that might look like from a 40,000 foot level and how these green spaces flow in and out of the city, and where there are ideas to help either reinforce green spaces that are existing or leverage new green spaces in the city, and begin thinking about that sort of template from a very broad regional scale. And then when we say richly layered, then we've got to bring it back down to the neighborhood scale. What's happening in each one of the neighborhoods and areas within the city of Atlanta? And how does that neighborhood scale really play a role? We call it sort of nested scale. How does that play a role in reinforcing the regional green network? And how does the regional green network reinforce what's happening at the neighborhood level? So that's what we mean by richly layered in terms of that standpoint. And then finally, we need to make sure that this green network plan is inclusive, that it's literate, and it's adaptive, meaning that every neighborhood in the city has free and unencumbered access to quality green space, where people can name 10 different species of native trees, not 10 different fast food restaurants, but 10 different species of native trees, and where decisions regarding the implementation of the framework are accomplished through a really inclusive, transparent, and participatory process. And what we also mean by adaptive is that we will come up with a framework, but over time we're going to need to adapt that framework and adapt how we implement this project as we begin to learn what's happening out in the landscape. And as we see what's working and what's not, and as the communities in Atlanta begin to change themselves. So this whole plan has to be adaptive in nature here. In some of our work with Baltimore City, one of the things that we noticed quite clearly, this photograph or this image on the right, this map, the areas in red where redlining happened, back in the 30s and 40s in the city. And in fact, if we look at the green space in the city of Atlanta, it matches up pretty well with hardly any green space within those redline districts historically, and the access to any green space. And so we see, very similar connections throughout the country in terms of sort of the socioeconomic aspects of some neighborhoods and their access and quality to green space, which certainly needs to play a role in all this. And then also, how do we get people involved in the process? How do we get them out there, involved in nature, to be working on these projects, taking care of these projects, being a steward of this green space is going to be really important. So that's going to be a part of this framework too, is how do we begin to do that. And how do we come up with plans that over time are adaptive, right? That they might start out one way, but in 10, 15, 20, 30 years, they're going to adapt to how the city grows and what kinds of green space the city wants and how it reacts to different political, social, economic issues out there. So as part of sort of the outputs for the urban ecology framework, we're going to be coming up with a physical framework plan for the city of Atlanta, but it's going to be a framework. It's not going to be specific design, right? The idea is that each neighborhood and other entities will work on specific designs. We'll also be coming up with policy recommendations in terms of building standards, in terms of zoning, in terms of comprehensive planning, certainly the tree ordinance, which I'll talk about in a minute, but other ways that we can begin to build or implement this green space. Even things like street trees, right? Street trees, believe it or not, provide a great sort of corridor for species migration. One of the issues, though, is that from an aesthetic standpoint, we like to have street trees that are all the same variety going down the street, right? And they're great, they work well, but what if we had understory and overstory sort of replicating a forest as street trees going down there, a variety of wildlife that we can support doing that. And the sort of diversity there could be really exciting. So you can imagine certain streets that are designated as wildlife corridors that really over time are transformed into this idea of these street trees taking on more of a forest character of understory and overstory street trees. And then the last part of the urban ecology framework is the tree protection ordinance, right? And we're going to be working on, after we go through and develop this whole framework for the city, we're going to be taking a step back and saying, okay, we have the existing tree protection ordinance. What can we do to update that? How can we improve upon that to reinforce the whole idea behind this urban ecology framework? So the last 6 months plus, we're going to be working on how to do that, or work with experts throughout the city on how we can begin to update that tree protection ordinance, and that'll be really, really important. Finally, this is the team that we've developed here. As Michael mentioned, it's a great team. Everybody here is in the city of Atlanta. Carlos Perez is going to be working on this project with us, and an assistant project manager. Jennifer Dowdell from our firm, Biohabitats, will be the project manager on this, and she is just coming off the Baltimore City work, so she managed that work and was instrumental in getting that green network through with Baltimore City. So she certainly earned her chops there, and I think she'll be great in terms of working on this project. We've got planners for environmental quality, PEQ. Inga Kennedy is going to be helping out with our outreach. Carrie Blind with RVI Landscape Architects is going to be working with us. American Forest, Ian, Conservation Fund, Stacy, I know Stacy's here today. He's going to be working with us on this. Alta Planning and Design will be playing a role in helping us really think about synthesizing this plan with the transportation network around the city of Atlanta and helping out with some of the GIS and storytelling that we do. And then Neil Norton with tree inspections is going to be helping out with the update on the tree protection ordinance. And then we put together this technical advisory group too that will be brought in to be sort of a peer review on a lot of the work that we do to make sure that we sort of have that outside technical group that's going to be looking at some of the things that we come up with and hopefully critiquing and questioning those to make it a more robust plan there. So I'll just leave you with this. Otto Leopold, he says, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." And hopefully that's the kind of sentiment that we'll be taking when we do the urban ecology framework for the city. Thank you.